so now that we have a working scraper that is capable of getting IPs off of input websites, we can begin with the checking process of these proxies to make sure that they are actually going to be worth us using. So I'm going to add in a second button here. We can just give the name check IPs and okay. So actually, instead of doing anything with the button 2 sub procedure, we're actually going to start off in a second sub procedure, and we'll just name it check proxy, since we're probably going to want to thread this later. It might not be worth even starting this in a button sub procedure that would be running on the same thread as the rest of the application. So we will just create a separate sub for this. So we'll just name it check proxy, and we're going to be needing the proxies that we found to be passed into this sub procedure. So what we will do first is we will define a new web proxy object. So dimk as new web proxy, and that will be our proxy IP that we're passing to our check proxy sub. We'll have it bypass our local proxy settings so that do we need to do that? Yeah, we'll need to do that. Okay, sorry. And then we will declare a request as an HTTP web request. And then we will send the request to there. You can technically do any site, but in this instance, I'm going to do ipchicken.com since it's super light to load and it doesn't have any type of, never been stopped. I've never gotten false 404s or anything from it, from too many requests or whatever. But it's important just to note that you do need to get rid of the S, since we're just going to be doing a HTTP web request instead of an HTTPS web request, just for simplicity's sake. So if you did try to make an HTTP web request to an HTTPS certificate, it just wouldn't work. You would just constantly get 404s. And then we're declaring it as a web request. Yeah, so basically we are just creating similar to our web client that we did up here, except in this case we're using a web request, and we're just creating a web request to ipchicken using, we haven't technically declared K as our proxy, but that's what we are setting up, and we'll do that in this line here. So request.proxy is going to be equal to K, and then request.timeout we can set to 5,000. So in these two lines, we're saying that our HTTP web request is going to be given the proxy K, which is our proxy IP, and you can set the timeout. So this is in milliseconds, so 5,000 milliseconds is 5 seconds. That should be a decent amount of time. If you wanted to get only faster proxies, you could lower this to 1,000. If you just wanted to make sure that they worked, period, you could set this higher to 10,000, and that would give you, results to depending on your needs. So, but I figure 5,000 is a pretty easy way to start. So now we'll actually have to collect the response. We don't need to actually declare system.net, do we? We already did that. So we're going to be declaring response as an HTTP web response, and then that'll be request.getResponse. And then we can just include a stream reader object. What is that? Instead, I don't think we'll use anything like this again. So system.io.streamReader. and that's going to be equal to new system.io dot stream reader response dot get response stream. Okay. So essentially these two, so we have a new response in HTTP web response. So this will actually be getting whatever IP chicken sends back when we make our response. And then we'll just store that string that we get back in an object. I don't know if we'll need that later, but it might just be worth setting up now. If not, that won't be necessary. Doesn't add much, but it does set up a whole extra stream reader. So yeah, so essentially what we can do is if it makes it this far, we will know that the IP is good. And so essentially what we're looking for is, which is why I don't think that we're going to end up needing this. But if it makes it through this entire process without 404ing, it means that we were able to successfully connect to IP chicken, which is going to be our qualification for what is a quote-unquote good IP versus a bad IP. If you use the proxy and in 5 seconds it can't actually connect to ipchicken.com, well, that's not very good, so we don't want to use that. But if it does make it through this entire process and it does make it all the way to this point, we do want it to be noted as a good proxy. So what we do need to do is, since if it doesn't actually make it, if it makes a bad request, it's going to 404, and if it 404s, then it's going to actually throw an exception, and we don't want to deal with that. So it would basically make it so that the application crashed every single time. So instead, we're just going to throw that in a try statement. Okay, so now instead of it 404ing, it should just be caught. So the try statement essentially tells Visual Studio or the application that you want to attempt to do everything in the try. If at any point it runs into an exception, immediately jump into the catch phase of the try statement. And here what we'll do is we will just message box bad. So that will be a way of determining whether or not the proxies are worth our time. I just realized that I can't actually test this yet because button 2 doesn't do anything yet. So for button 2, just as a test, what we can do is check proxy list view 1 dot item 0 dot sub item 0 dot text. So this will be passing as our proxy the first proxy in our list. So item 0, the first item, and then sub item 0, the first column of that first item, and then the text is string. So let's see. I can get IPs and then check IPs. So that's telling me that this first IP here isn't good. Okay, so we can assume I was hoping to get a good response, so that I knew same IP, of course. Okay. So that one timed out after the 5 seconds. Okay. Well, that makes me think that it's working since it didn't instantly just give me a bad request. It actually attempted to connect. Okay. So now that we know that that's working, or at least that it should be working, we can start setting up to iterate through in a relatively nice way. So I'm going to make a new sub called output, and then we'll have the status as a string. So we'll have this check proxy sub pass all of its results onto this output sub, because we're going to be running this check proxy sub on a different thread. So for those of you who don't know, you can't interact with the main UI off of a separate thread. That's a cross-thread exception. So we will need to be running the check proxy sub procedure on a separate thread and then have it call a different sub procedure in order to get back onto the UI thread in order to make a change to our list view. So so the first thing we'll have to do is get the yeah, we'll first get this onto a separate thread. So we'll check first if since we'll be interacting with the list view, we'll first check if the list view needs to be invoked. So the invoke will actually get us onto our UI thread, and then from there we'll be able to actually make changes to our list view. So we'll be, if we do need to invoke it, we will be invoking it at the output subprocedure, and we will also need to be passing the status. That should work. It's not yelling at me, so it's a good sign. Okay, and so here we can include all of the code that we will be doing depending on how or what we want to do once we're back on our UI thread, which will be updating the list view. So let's go back up to here, and instead of it message boxing, let's do output good, I guess. And oops, we'll separate by a colon, and then we'll need some way to keep track of. Okay, so down here, let's declare a list of string. Okay, so sorry about how jumpy this is becoming. It's just gonna have to kind of all come together at once, I think. I was hoping to have it in some sort of order, but I think that it's just going to kind of all come together at once. So essentially what we're going to need to do is, since we won't be able to reference to get an index of the item in the list view here, since even just trying to look at the index of one of the list view items in our list view 1 would be a cross-thread exception, we're going to first need to define a new list here, a public list, a global list. It's not public, it's global. And by using this, we will try to keep track of our indexes here instead of in the actual list view. So for each item in our list view, we will be adding item.subitem0.text. So basically for every single item in our list view 1.items, we're going to be adding in the proxy to this new cureless list that we made. And then that should allow us to, here when we're passing this, cureless.index of proxy IP. So we aren't quite there yet, but if you can imagine, our output is going to need to know where in the list view this proxy is, because if it doesn't know where the proxy is, it won't be able to actually tell us if that specific proxy is good or not. So what I'm trying to pass, the information I'm trying to pass to the output subprocedure is that not only whether or not the proxy is good or bad, but I also need to tell it the position of the proxy so that it's capable of updating the field correctly. So this new output that we're doing is going to look like this. So it's going to look like good, and then a colon, and then 3. So that's telling me that the third, technically fourth proxy, because it's 0 indexed, but the fourth proxy to the third proxy, I don't really care, looks good. And if I was 7, then the 7th proxy is good. If the 9th proxy is good, 10th is good. So that's the type of information that I'm now trying to pass along to my output sub. And now it should be as easy as declaring a new integer, which is going to equal status.split, and then we want to split it by the colon And here for the integer, we want to get the second value, but it's 0 index, remember? So it's going to be get value 1, and then we're going to just re-declare status so that we don't keep making new strings that need to be stored. Dot get value 0. So essentially now this, if we're passing to our output good 8, we're giving it the integer the value of 8, and we're giving the status the value of good. And then that should be all we need to update the list view properly with the current status of the IP, the proxies. And so now we should just have to do list view one.items int dot subitems 1, since we're putting all of this into the second column in our list view. Dot text is going to be equal to status. So that should work. And then finally, we'll actually have to make the call to the output sub. Since I don't plan on doing too many proxies, I'm just going to use a thread pool to do that. If you have a ton of proxies, this might end up kind of slowing down. So you might need to come up with a better way of checking the proxies, but thread pool should handle quite a few, I would say 100 without, what was I going to import? Without too much problem. So yeah. Right, okay. Just checking my notes, making sure I didn't miss anything dumb. I don't think I have. I think all my logic still makes sense. So what we're going to be doing is using a thread pool worker item to actually take care of calling the output sub for us. And by using a thread pool instead of an actual thread, we are reducing the chances, we're reducing basically the stress of the threads on the machine, since the thread pool works much more cooperatively than just calling separate individual threads. And this is probably the best way that I can think of to do this in the simplest form. So we call back address of, and then through this we're going to be using the check proxy sub, and as a parameter we're going to be passing item.subitem 0.text. So essentially it doesn't like that. Okay, I have no idea why that error is just hanging. I have absolutely no idea. Everything's working fine, so okay, that was really frustrating. That made me stop for like 20 minutes trying to figure out what was actually going wrong. Absolutely nothing, of course. Okay. I have no idea what that was. I apologize. Okay, so essentially what we're going to be doing is for each item, we're going to be adding that item to the cure list, and then the cure list is just going to be used to actually find the index of the item for us. And then we're also going to be adding in a thread pool worker item that will be running the check proxy sub procedure, and we're going to be submitting that proxy as our input. So that being said, let's see how this works. All right, check IPs. Oh, that was silly. I forgot to change that to output. Okay, and so as you can see now, most of the IPs aren't very good in terms of, and remember this doesn't necessarily mean they're not working, but that in terms of their speed, they are a little bit too slow for what we are hoping to accomplish with our 5-second load times. So yeah, so that should be a decent introduction to the checker. we have a little bit more to do, but that is the overall basics of how this would actually function.